Last video for this week, cell signaling. This is something I like to introduce here because it's so important throughout the course, and it is related to membrane proteins. So some of those proteins we saw on the membrane are receptor proteins. But first I want to go a little bit broader than what your book does at this point. I had you read a little bit of it ahead so you get the kind of big idea of cell communication. Cell communication is super important. There's different types that I want to briefly summarize here. So one type is local. Two cells right next to each other can talk to each other through gap junctions. This is direct cytoplasmic connections between two cells that are adjacent next to each other. This is really important for smoothing cardiac muscle, for the cardiac muscle to fire and contract synchronously together. Epithelial cells do this. It also can pass the nutrients, electrolytes, and signaling molecules from one cell to the next, like this. Other types of local are autocrine and paracrine. Some people classify these as hormones because the molecules are the same, but the difference is the locality. So autocrine is signaling yourself, releasing a molecule that binds to a receptor on its own cell. Paracrine means nearby. So this is adjacent cells that are actually secreted from the cell and bind to a nearby cell. So different than gap junctions in terms of how it's set up, right? The molecules are also going to be somewhat different. There's also long distance signaling, and both of these will come back to when we talk about autonomic nervous system and nervous system. So these two main types are the endocrine system signaling and the nervous system signaling. Endocrine cells release hormones into the bloodstream. So the definition of hormone is that it's released into the bloodstream and then by an endocrine gland. The definition of an endocrine gland, though, is that it releases a hormone, which means it goes into the bloodstream. These hormones then bind to cells that have receptors for that hormone. So a receptor matches up to the hormone itself. This target cell then can have some response. So you can see how this will be important for like responding to something. The other one is nervous system. So neurotransmitters are chemicals released by a neuron. This would be the neurotransmitter, and neurons can either be a couple centimeters or meters long. That would, from the start of that cell down its axon to where it releases that neurotransmitter, obviously we'll come back to neurons, but it would talk to just one target cell. And this can be long distance. So this is the type of cell communication. And then I want to review for you quickly these types of membrane proteins. So right now, basically, we're talking about these guys. We're talking about receptors that bind to chemical messengers. These chemical messengers either could be hormones, neurotransmitters. Paracrines and autocrines are similar structures to hormones, but traveling more locally. Any chemical messenger that's sent and then received by another cell. So receptors are going to be really important. So let's talk about them some more. So here's some types of receptors. Receptors can be chemically gated or channel linked. These are two different names for this. The terminology for this is not the point. It's to understand what the protein does. And when you get into examples of these proteins, then they have names that we'll get to. So for now, what I want you to know is there are receptors that require an ion to bind to them, and then they open. So that's what's happening here. This would be a gated ion channel. The ion channels we talked about, I said there's a different topic, but it's really the same, right? Here is a gated ion channel. When something binds to it, it's chemically gated, and then a channel opens. This would be a gated ion channel as a name for this. Then the one I want to focus on here briefly go over, because you'll see it again, repetition is what I want for this one here, is G protein coupled receptors. This is second messenger signaling. What that means is it's a first messenger. That's going to be the chemical messenger that came from the neuron, the hormone, whatever. There's going to be a second messenger. There's going to be something happening inside the cell. This is one schematic of this here. Something happens inside the cell. So I want to walk through this with the image from your book. So what happens here is there is a first messenger. Epinephrine is the example your book uses for this little red triangle, and it's going to bind to a receptor in the plasma membrane. This receptor is a G protein coupled receptor. What that means is it is coupled or linked to a G protein. When the first messenger binds, this G protein is released. The G protein is then going to bind to an enzyme. This is a membrane protein that's an enzyme, adenylate cyclase. It converts ATP to CAMP. CAMP is a second messenger. It is a molecule that's going to act inside the cell to do other stuff. This is an example of a signaling cascade. One thing leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing. CAMP is now inside the cell and is going to act as a messenger. It's going to activate kinases. Kinases phosphorylate proteins. So this activated kinase is going to activate other enzymes that have all kinds of effects, so various metabolic effects. This is going to be huge for the autonomic nervous system, as well as how our visual system works, lots of stuff. So the same kind of similar signaling cascade is used in many different parts of the body, and it's really cool. So this would be G protein coupled receptors and second messenger systems that are a type of signaling cascade. There are other types of signaling cascades as well. What I wanted to show here is that idea of a kinase. So it's an enzyme that is going to add a phosphate group to a protein. This is a protein. When the kinase adds a phosphate group, that enzyme that typically is activated. Some it's the opposite. Phosphatases remove phosphate groups to go this direction. So you could activate or deactivate enzymes by changing their structure. Adding or removing that phosphate group changes the structure. That's what's happening right here in order to activate various enzymes that are going to have various metabolic effects. We'll see examples of that when we get to other systems. So hopefully what we've done here is describe the 4 general mechanisms of cell-to-cell communication. So gap junctions, neural signaling, paracrines, and endocrine signaling. Autocrine, you can know it or not. And then describe second messenger signaling. So I want you to start to learn that pathway of G protein coupled receptors and the steps in it, because repetition is good and we will use it later. All right, have a great, please let me know what questions you have.